Let me get started. Again, this is John Kane. This is Resistance Radio. I appreciate the fact that you tune this in, whether you catch us on the radio or whether you catch us online, however you do it. Um, as many of you know, I oftentimes address issues from a Native perspective that's probably a counter narrative to what you've been told, what you've been taught, what you've been spoon fed. And let's be honest, the both social media and frankly the media in general historically has been geared towards a narrative. And part of what, even what they teach you in school, grade school, high school, even at the college level, there there is a an effort to promote um, nationalism. I mean, that's become a little bit more of a maybe a dirty word, but in the end of the day, the idea of promoting patriotism, there's no question that teaching history, civics, and all that other stuff was a part of bolstering Americanism. That's what it was for. I mean, that's what it was geared towards. I mean, and it's no coincidence that Texas, of all states, has played a dominant role in the production of textbooks for, especially history textbooks, for for a very very long time. And of course, Texas is about as conservative a state as there is, and regardless of a few politicians that come out of the ranks that are anything but as a in general, it is a very conservative state, and all of those books are geared towards all of those textbooks, those history textbooks, those social studies textbooks. They've all been geared towards promoting patriotism. I mean, in school, they teach a 5-year-old to stand up and pledge allegiance to the flag. And again, kindergartners are taught the lyrics, the words of the national anthem. Not only the first verse, because it gets a little ugly as you get into the second and third verse in particular. But I mean, there's an effort, and as much as people can look at um, how certain nations, treat their kids, and everybody thinks about the brown shirts and that kind of stuff from Nazi Germany, and all of what looks at like, just complete indoctrination into this idea of white supremacy and Nazism and that kind of stuff. Well, the United States has got some of the same thing going on, and of course, in the United States, you also have the role of church, government, education, the judicial system. It's all geared towards a level of assimilation and indoctrination. And I recently have come to the conclusion that while I never have in the past considered myself an anarchist, because of the view that I now have of governing systems, the institutions of government, that that's what's turned me off to this notion of supporting any governing system, and including most native governing systems, because they've all been contaminated. I mean, and I think there's a little question about that. I mean, what people refer to as tribal government is oftentimes government that has been reshaped by the United States, or even the so-called traditional governing systems have been, basically, they've been influenced heavily by states, by federal government, by other organizations. Look, only a few years ago, I remember just scratching my head when I saw, I think it was the Osage Nation of, no, Choctaw Nation. I'm sorry, Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma passing a tribal council resolution declaring that they were a Christian nation. I mean, for all of the belief that people have about the United States and their separation of church and state, which I don't necessarily believe really exists in that way, the idea that a native territory that has become so indoctrinated and so affected by U.S. Culture, and I use that almost with air quotes, because I think there's a real lack of culture that exists in the United States in terms of a redeeming quality of culture. But when you consider that the Choctaw would actually pass a tribal council resolution declaring themselves a Christian nation, well, where does that leave you know uh, the number of Choctaw who are not Christian? And of course, what does that even mean to say you're a Christian nation? I mean, there's so many interpretations of scripture and Bible and what it means to be a Christian. The vast majority of people that I know who are Christian will swear that the United States is not a is not a Christian nation, and that that the behaviors of the of most Christians is not Christian. Well, it's funny. It still says "In God We Trust" on the money. It still says "Pledge allegiance to the flag in the United States of America," and one nation under God. All of that stuff. It's still there's a lot of that in there. I mean, when people take the oath of office, they're swearing out a Bible for the most part. I mean, I don't know any president of the United States, or frankly, I very few politicians would dare swear any other type of oath. I mean, when you enter in a court, you either affirm to tell the truth or you swear to tell the truth on a Bible. Well, what's the implications of that? So, I mean, again, it's hard to suggest, although there's plenty of contradictions. I mentioned this, in the wake of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It basically begins by almost asserting that, yes, while we acknowledge that all men are created equal, we violate that by enslaving people. We violate this notion of creation, and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. I mean, that's the language from the Declaration of Independence. So they acknowledge all that stuff and then create a country that has slavery, that has genocide, that has limited rights to the vast majorities of the population. White landowning men, white men with money, were the power. Well, that's not what's suggested in the opening lines. And of course, when you talk about that all men are created equal, you're essentially creating a whole system that violates the powers of creation and what you acknowledge as equality, what you acknowledge as the right to pursue happiness, because you went about destroying that. So I think there's language in certainly in the Declaration of Independence that suggests that those signers, and certainly Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the document, believed that while there may be the power of creation and all men may have been created equal, that's not what we're doing here. That's not what we're doing here. And so that out of the gate sounds like, yeah, there is a separation of church and state, and of belief and faith, and all these things that you will acknowledge about equality, because you're sure as hell not creating that. So. But as time goes on, I mean, look, even the original draft of the Pledge of Allegiance didn't have one nation under God. They added that later. So I mean, it's whether the United States purports itself to be a Christian nation, and certainly every politician does their damnedest to convince, especially presidents, that they are Christians and that they are church-going Christians and that kind of stuff, and most of it's just performative. But anyway, that's part of the reason that I can push back on even the idea, the concept of citizenship. And I've talked about this a great deal on the program over this last month, both because of, again, running up to the 4th of July. And cases like the Birthright citizenship case that went before the Supreme Court. I've had to make it real clear that there's still a lot of contradiction. It doesn't matter that the courts ruled in favor of birthright citizenship being a constitutional right. There was still some dissension there, and the possibility that that birthright citizenship could be taken away is still possible. It doesn't matter they could do stuff statutorily. They could pass laws, and the laws oftentimes do not necessarily have to withstand constitutional muster. They don't constitutional scrutiny. And one of the things that I've talked about, and frankly, I don't know anybody else who's even brought this subject up, but it's interesting. In 1868, when they passed the 14th Amendment, which by all for all intents and purposes, was geared towards solving the post-slavery problems that existed. I mean, so if you were formerly enslaved and you were free, what did that mean? I mean, before 1868, you could be free, and in fact, there were free states and there were slave states. That's what existed in the United States, and some of the issues that existed, like what happens if a person leaves a state where they were enslaved and they enter a free state? Do they become free? Well, that didn't hold up in court very well. And in fact, a president from the area that I live in, near Buffalo, New York, Millard Fillmore, he signed into law the Fugitive Slave Act that allowed people to go into the free states and reclaim their property. So you weren't free if you were in a free state. But what does that even mean? I mean, and in 1868, when citizenship was granted to all persons born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and that's what it says in the 14th Amendment, which implies if you're born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. But did that include being free? So what were you if you were, quote unquote, free before 1868? What happened after 1868? Because I would argue that citizenship strips a certain level of freedom. And from a native standpoint, I can make that argument. Because we were excluded from citizenship in the original Constitution, in the Articles of Confederation, and in the amendment to the Constitution in the 14th Amendment. We were still not, we were among those people who were not subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So the specific exclusion to the birthright citizenship part of the 14th Amendment were those who were children of diplomats. So if you were here, if you were born in the United States to a foreign diplomat, then you weren't entitled to birthright citizenship. You still retained the citizenship of the nation of your parents. And if you were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, which was essentially native people, and now some people were. Some people were already becoming, essentially citizens of the United States, some native people. But there was no blanket birthright citizenship for native people. In fact, that's the case that Trump tried to use in his argument against birthright citizenship. He tried to use a native case. So it was in the wake of the 14th Amendment, and the courts held that no, native people are not, entitled to birthright citizenship. That's what the court held, and that's the case that Trump tried to argue. Now, since then, the United States has done a few other things to include people into their citizenry, but they weren't amendments to the Constitution. But let me the other thing I want to mention about the 14th Amendment, and I've mentioned it here on the program. There's two parts to it. The second section of the 14th Amendment had to do with the apportionment of congressional representation. So in that effort, what they said is all persons were to be counted, not all citizens, which is kind of an awkward, area that's not real clear. It's not explicit, as they say. So according to the Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, all persons in the United States. Now, that can't include diplomats, right? I mean, it can't include that, but it says all persons. But where does that leave people like native people? We were still not being counted in the census. So even though the 14th Amendment says all persons were to be counted for apportionment of congressional representation, it still wasn't real clear. And when native people and others who were made into U.S. citizens or declared U.S. citizens had citizenship imposed upon them, they never once again addressed the apportionment stuff. So, again, let me say this about the 14th Amendment. It says if you are born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you are a U.S. citizen. It doesn't say you're entitled to U.S. citizenship. It doesn't say that you may be or that that citizenship is granted. It just says you are, which is kind of an imposition. And then here's the thing that's absent from the 14th Amendment. And this is one of the issues that the Trump administration tried to raise. There's no oath. You didn't have to take an oath. I mean, if you come to the United States from another country as an immigrant and you go through the process to become a U.S. citizen, at some point, part of that process is you swearing to uphold the U.S. Constitution, just like anybody who takes an office does. There's an oath that you must state, probably swearing on a Bible, but there's no allegiance associated. There's no pledge of allegiance associated with the 14th Amendment. There's nothing to say that all those persons born in the United States had now accepted this, essentially this burden. And when I say burden, look, you are now taxable. You would argue whether you were taxable before, but there's a lot of responsibility, and there's citizenship is not freedom, because now you are under the jurisdiction. Were you before that? That could be debated, right? And certainly, the 14th Amendment made it clear that there were people who were in the so-called within the territorial boundaries of the United States that were not subject to U.S. jurisdiction. And I would argue that those people were still free. Us, Native people. We still enjoyed our autonomy, even as we were still being, persecuted and oppressed, but legally we were an autonomous people. We were separate from the United States. And I would argue that was a free and independent existence. So two things happened after the 14th Amendment was passed. One was the United States illegally occupied and took over, claimed the Hawaiian Kingdom. They dismantled the kingdom, and they helped prop up a bunch of white guys who said that Hawaii was now a republic, not a monarchy. And through a joint resolution of Congress, which isn't the legal process for adding lands or for annexing property. That's not the legal process. But that's what the United States did to annex, not a treaty, nothing that required the 2/3 majority of the Senate, the way the legal process is laid out. No, they did it through a simple majority through a joint resolution of Congress. So what's a joint resolution of Congress? Well, a joint resolution of Congress is how they name holidays. It's how they give names to national parks. That's what a joint resolution of Congress is. They oftentimes will pass a resolution that will acknowledge something or maybe even apologize. In fact, having used this joint resolution of Congress, which does not have the force of law, by the way, having used the joint resolution of Congress to steal away and illegally occupy the Kingdom of Hawaii and make the Hawaiian people U.S. citizens, the United States, again, 100 years later, during the Bill Clinton administration, through a joint resolution of Congress, passed an apology resolution. And when Hawaiian people tried to use that resolution, that joint resolution of Congress, this legal act, essentially, to raise some issues relating to lands that that they were arguing were still Crown lands, the Supreme Court said, joint resolutions of Congress have no force of law. So the Hawaiian people who were overtaken by a joint resolution of Congress tried to use an acknowledgement by Congress that what they did was wrong in a legal proceeding, and the Supreme Court said, no, joint resolutions of Congress had no force of law. Now, they didn't go backwards. They didn't say, okay, so we got to take back that whole thing of taking over your lands. No, they didn't. They just meant in the modern era, in 1993, when Congress passed a joint resolution to take Hawaii and to take the Hawaiian people, to impose U.S. citizenship. Again, no allegiance test, no process for naturalization. No, they just declared it. So they just Hawaiian people, as far as the United States was concerned, through a joint resolution. And just keep in mind, an amendment to the Constitution is the highest standard for creating a U.S. policy. The lowest standard, with the least amount of legal authority to go along with, no force of law, is a joint resolution of Congress. That's the distinction between how the formerly enslaved people of African descent and others who were born in the United States were made citizens, and how the Hawaiian people had that imposed upon them. I mean, that's pretty significant, folks. That is pretty significant. And I think it's important that people realize what was done. So that was in the at the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, this was done during President McKinley's term. So about 20 years later or so, in 1924, the United States says we got to solve this Indian problem we have because we never addressed it with the 14th Amendment. And we did something with Hawaiian people when we took their land, but we got to fix this Indian problem. So a congressman from New York State basically put a bill before Congress called the Snyder Act, or called the Indian Citizenship Act, where they simply just declared, they said, all Indians, essentially, born within the territorial limits. Now, that's also a vague term. It doesn't say within the United States or subject to the jurisdiction thereof. It says all Indians born within the territorial limits of the United States are hereby citizens of the United States. Are declared citizens of the United States. So they made this broad declaration. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about Native people that are across the entire continent, essentially. Diverse, we all had different kinds of treaties and all that other stuff. Some had many treaties, some had very clear treaties about who they were, owning property and stuff like that. But in 1924, it wasn't the highest standard for creating a U.S. policy, and it wasn't the lowest, but it was in a unique place by doing it through a statute, through a law, declaring that Native people were citizens of the United States. Not asking us. No creating a process. Again, no allegiance test, no swearing an oath that you are hereby, we accept U.S. No, none of that. They just passed a law. Now the question is, was there any precedent for that? Well, there isn't, because Congress was never granted that kind of authority. In order to make another people from another territory that is not part of the United States, that had to go through, again, the annexation process. 2/3 majority of Senate. That's not what they did to Hawaii, and that's not what they did to us. We had no annexation treaty. We had no broad request to declare all of us U.S. citizens. No, none of that existed. So how did the United States have the authority to do this? Well, again, I've talked about in this program a great deal. I talked about the doctrine of discovery, I've talked about the trust doctrine, and I've talked about the plenary powers doctrine. And this is an example of that. This is Congress saying, well, we can do anything we want to Native people. And it doesn't have to withstand any kind of constitutional scrutiny. Nobody can sit here and tell me today that there's any place in the Constitution that grants Congress the power to make a distinct autonomous people U.S. citizens, especially without their permission, especially without us asking or entering into any kind of agreement. No, there's not even an implied agreement, let alone an explicit one. So what authority, how does the United States do it? Well, they do it under the guise of the plenary powers doctrine, which basically has been a court created, the Supreme Court during the slave era, created this idea that Congress should have ultimate and unlimited authority to pass laws, to legislate over, not for, but over Native people. And that's how the Indian Citizenship Act comes to be. That's how it comes to be. But see, to this day, nobody's looked at the three different processes: constitutional amendment, joint resolution of Congress, and a law passed under this plenary powers doctrine. Nobody's looked at it. Nobody's ever challenged. I mean, they've looked. Now the 14th Amendment has been scrutinized. But again, a pretty high standard. 3/4 of the Senate have to agree to a constitutional amendment. So it's a pretty high standard. But those other two, what they did to Hawaiian people, what they did to Native people, nobody's even questioned whether it's illegal. And again, 100 years after they did it to Hawaiian people, they passed a joint resolution of Congress apologizing for the role the United States played in the toppling of the Hawaiian kingdom. The question is, does the Hawaiian kingdom still exist? Does it have a legal right to exist? I know many Hawaiians who argue that, and I agree with them. But I also agree that when they passed the Citizenship Act in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act, I maintain that we have say. They may pass that law, and just like in Hawaii, and the same thing with Native people, we may look at that joint resolution of Congress, which I think is still pretty weak. We may look at the Indian Citizenship Act as a legal justification for us to be entitled to U.S. citizenship. In fact, the argument that Trump made in this birthright citizenship case, it was negated by the fact that in 1924, all Native people were declared U.S. citizens. So essentially, Native people, as far as that piece of legislation went, not amendment to the Constitution, but piece of legislation, it was they did it by statute, included Native people or had Native people granted birthright citizenship. Well, and that's still pretty awkward, especially since we don't necessarily always agree that the border, the U.S.-Canadian border, or for the Otham people along the southern border, does that border separate us as a people? I mean, they may have drawn lines in the dirt, but I'm Mohawk. I'm Gunyagahaga. My people are on either side of that imaginary line, and that's what they are. They are imaginary lines because they were just made up. Yeah, sometimes they follow a river, which isn't imaginary. But the idea to say this side of the river is one people and that side of the river are another people, no, that's just not right. It's not right. It's a man-made thing. Now, if the people who say that accept it is one thing, but what if you're people who don't? What if you are those Native people who live along where they drew that line, between Mexico and the United States? I know as a Mohawk, as a Gunyagahaga, I don't recognize that line that they drew, whether it followed the St. Lawrence and where it deviates from it, I say no. I don't have to acknowledge that. Now, it's problematic not to acknowledge it. You got to find crafty ways of crossing that man-made line, and we do. But I mean, so this is what very, very few people have ever fully addressed, and to this day, the idea of declaring Native Hawaiians U.S. citizens and declaring Native people on the continent Hawaiian or U.S. citizens has not properly been questioned. And in fact, nobody will fully question the plenary powers doctrine. It gets raised because it's relied upon. I mean, and fairly recently, the current justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, three of them, have questioned whether the plenary powers doctrine, this notion that Congress has this ultimate and unchecked authority, whether it's legal. Two justices voted against the challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act, specifically because of that. Because that case, the Brackeen case as it's known, was essentially dismissed, was thrown out of court based solely on this on the plenary powers doctrine, because what the court said, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act and it can't be challenged. And they did not only challenge the Brackeens, the Brackeen family, on their standing, but they said Congress has this plenary powers. Two of the justices, Supreme Court, Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas, said, yeah, we're not so sure. We're not so sure that you can defend the Indian Child Welfare Act based solely on Congress having this ultimate authority. And others have challenged it too. I mean, on a couple of cases, jurisdictional cases. And I argue that the plenary powers doctrine is BS. It's a fabricated power. And again, the irony is we oftentimes hear the right suggest that there shouldn't be activist judges. Judges should not be able to legislate from the bench. Well, that's exactly what they did to Native people. They codified the doctrine of Christian discovery. The court did that. Slave era court did that in the 1820s. Then they created two other legal doctrines specifically. Again, these three legal doctrines are only applied to Native people. The doctrine of Christian discovery was about Native people and our lands. And then the trust doctrine, where they essentially said that we were, akin to wards of the federal government. And then they go ahead and pretend that they can appoint themselves our trustees, relegate us as wards of the federal government. And if you haven't seen Killers of the Flower Moon, there's no greater example, but it's not the only example, but there's no greater example of just how oppressive the United States even treated Native people when we had money. Forget about what the abject poverty that it caused Native people. So they created the trust doctrine where we are relegated as wards of the federal government, and the United States appoints themselves our trustees. None of it legal. And there's no trust agreement. There's no legal look. A trust agreement is a legal thing, and it's documented. And there's three parties. There's one with the authority to create the trust, and that's considered the grantor, which the United States just proclaims themselves the grantor. Then there's the trustee, which is those who are given the responsibility to oversee the fiduciary responsibility to the beneficiary or the ward. The United States not only claims to be the grantor, but they claim to be the trustee, and they've made it very clear that they've constructed this so-called trust relationship so that they are the primary beneficiary, not the wards of the state, not the wards of the federal government. We aren't the primary beneficiary. In fact, Alito and others have made their clear argument that the trust relationship, the whole trust doctrine, was created for the federal government to control us, not to protect us. It's never been about protecting our assets or protecting our freedoms or anything else. No, it's been about taking our assets, taking our freedom, and appointing themselves in a position to be the primary beneficiary of our lands, of our resources. And of course, the plenary powers doctrine, which is a complete, fabricated power that the courts claim Congress has. And that's how they declared us U.S. citizens. See, and I think that what's problematic is that when you have these three legal doctrines still functioning and being relied upon to this day, and any case involving Native people always relies on the doctrine of Christian discovery over jurisdictional issues, and they rely on the doctrine of Christian discovery. They actually cite the case, Johnson v. McIntosh, that's the case, and they rely on that to bolster the trust doctrine and the plenary powers doctrine. So they all are made up. They're all based on a made-up authority. Nothing from the Constitution of the United States. I mean, and again, I can't be any more clear. The Constitution is explicit when it suggests that we aren't included, that we are not subject to it. We have not been subjugated. There's nothing in any of the foundational documents that suggest that Native people have been conquered, even though that's the myth that's taught in school to this day, that somehow we become a conquered people. Again, let me clarify that. In the entire history of the United States, 250 years, there's only been dozens of real conflict, military conflicts with Native peoples. Under 50. There's been under 50 military conflicts with Native peoples. And the United States didn't win them all. Now, keep that in mind. If you suggest there were only, if you use 50 as a number, there were hundreds, just shy of 1,000 distinct Native peoples that the United States was forced to acknowledge were independent and autonomous from the United States. Some 700 or 800 distinct Native peoples. So if you're going to suggest that less than 50 conflicts where the United States never really got necessarily surrender agreements out of us, but would claim because of massacres and just ungodly atrocities committed against Native peoples, that somehow that we became conquered. I mean, again, going back to the 1820s, Chief Justice John Marshall suggested, right alongside with the doctrine of Christian discovery, that however extravagant the pretension of converting discovery of an inhabited country into conquest may appear, if you can get away with it, if you can do it, if you can assert it and maintain that notion. Now, keep in mind, think about Native people who had no idea the United States was claiming that we were conquered, especially since we didn't have any conflict with them. So the idea that the Supreme Court justice The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would suggest if you can concoct this, you know, this pretension, I guess is what he said, this extravagant pretension that's laying your eyes on a people as Christians was tantamount, could be converted into conquest. How would we even know that the United States was claiming to have conquered us? And that's really the only language. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the Articles of Confederation. It's only in this one instance where a Supreme Court justice, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, equates discovering us with conquering us. And then it just gets assumed from there on after. So, I mean, and that's why, look, I've got a film called The Long Hope. I hope to come to Washington, D.C. this fall and do a couple screenings of it. I want people to understand this. And I know some people listen to the program and say, man, that John Kane always talks about the same thing. No, I don't. But I have to reiterate this because it's important that people realize that this notion of rule of law sounds quaint. This notion of democracy sounds great. This notion of just governance coming from the consent of the governed, that sounds nice. But that's not what exists in the United States. And it certainly doesn't exist for Native people. Native people have never been treated in a so-called constitutional manner, partially because we weren't included in it. How do you take a people who are outside? I mean, think about the court system. Let me say this. U.S. courts, federal courts in particular, and the Supreme Court included, their only job is to determine whether people, either through law or whether laws, are constitutional or not. Is there something that the president's doing, or is there something that Congress has done that needs to be looked at more thoroughly to make sure that it fits within the framework? The whole justification for courts is to determine the constitutionality of a law, a treatment, or an act, or something that the United States has done. Constitutionality is their only job. So how does a court determine what's just for a people who are outside the U.S. Constitution? I mean, it's like a court. I mean, and I know it's bizarre to think that the United States could go into Venezuela and kidnap and abduct the president of Venezuela. I mean, it's absurd. Was it constitutional? Oh, of course it wasn't constitutional. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives the United States the authority to go in and abduct a leader of another country. And that's this administration. That's now. That's this current administration doing this. So historically, and this is what I always have to remind people, as many of you scratch your head and can't believe that, not only that Trump got elected twice, meaning you elected him, even if you didn't vote for Donald Trump, if you participate in the electoral system, then the result of that election, you played a role in it. You participated in it. So yes, Americans, you elected Donald Trump. Even if you didn't vote for him, you elected him because that's your system of governance. And, granted, but some people say, well, I didn't vote. I don't vote in this election. Yeah, but you still accept U.S. citizenship and all that comes with it, including, the electoral process, which is racist in of itself. But this stuff has existed from day one. I spent, an entire program talking about the fact that Thomas Jefferson was a pedophile, that he was not just a slaver, but that he held his one of his slaves as a sex slave, had 6 children with a slave, and kept those children as slaves. He eventually freed them, I guess. But what did that even mean? Again, what does it mean if you can't be a U.S. citizen? What does a free person outside of U.S. citizenship, what does that mean? And what does it mean today? Does that even exist? So this is what's bizarre, so bizarre about U.S. jurisprudence, the law, policies, procedures, and there are no people that have bigger question marks associated with our existence than Native people. Than Native people. I'm going to shift gears a little bit because I'm constantly in a conversation about the fact that Native people enlist in the U.S. military at a high rate, and people come up with this just bizarre justification. One of the things is that somehow we are genetically predisposed to need to be armed and be a part of a military. You know, they say it's our warrior culture, and of course that's crap. There's nothing genetic about enlisting in the armed forces, for no matter which side you enlist in. But to be clear, Native people who claim that they enlist to protect their lands, from who? Only one military in the 250 years has been a threat to Native people. The U.S. military. Only one military has attacked our people. The U.S. military. So how is joining that military that murdered your ancestors, including men, women, and children, stole your land, how is joining that military protecting your lands? You're becoming part of the problem. And I find that very problematic. And of course, we get into the whole debate about citizenship as well, right? I mean, are you a citizen? So if you're a citizen, are you still party to the treaties that your people signed with the United States, even if the United States has broken those treaties? So I mean, it gets really, really awkward. But see, here's the thing that I wanted to address. As unfortunate as it is that, several young people have died in this military conflict that Trump initiated against Iran, they signed up for it. I'm not saying they wanted to die. Nobody enlists in the military to die. Some enlist to kill, and they all get issued a rifle or some means to be involved in weaponry. So you didn't enlist in the U.S. military with peaceful intentions. No, you may have done it because you thought you were going to get a job, you were going to get some college funding out of the whole deal. But at the end of the day, you enlisted in the U.S. war machine that exists all over the world. So as much as I feel saddened by any loss of life, when I saw all of the rest in peace posts on social media for these, I think, 4 people who died recently in this Iran, conflict, there's a part of me that says, look, they're not resting in peace. They're dead. They died. They were killed. And why did they get killed? Because they enlisted in the U.S. armed military. And they didn't sign up to the Peace Corps. They signed up to the U.S. military. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that they got what they deserved. They didn't. Nobody signs up. Nobody enlists in the military hoping that Donald Trump is going to put them in harm's way or anybody else. But he did. And you surrendered yourself to that. And it was entirely possible that you would be asked to kill somebody. Those people who went to abduct Nicolas Maduro and his wife, you went there and you killed people. You killed people, and you got to live with that. So whoever was responsible for that drone that killed 170 schoolgirls in Iran, somebody has to live with that. So you not only have to live with this idea of killing somebody because you signed up, because you enlisted, and you could claim you have done it out of patriotism. You can claim that you've done it for all of these really good reasons. But in all likelihood, regardless of your status in the United States, and let's face it, there's an entire class structure. There are the haves and the have-nots. The vast and overwhelming majority of people who enlist in the military are doing it because they didn't have a whole lot of better options. I mean, you literally have to assume that they chose to join the military because they perceived that was the best thing for them to do. And for many people, the alternatives were pretty slim. For Native people, where the United States has created conditions on most Native territories that are beneath what most people would regard as third world conditions. Highest poverty rates, the lowest life expectancy, the highest substance abuse, the highest high school dropout rate, teen pregnancy, unemployment. Every category you don't want to be the highest in, that's what exists on Native territory. I even live here. I live on the Cattaraugus territory of Seneca Nation. Half the people on this territory still live below or at or below the poverty line, even though the Seneca Nation has 3 casinos. Why? Because the state, skims almost 50% of the gaming revenue. Like the state needs it. So a full third, but I think closer to a half of the people who live on this territory live at or below the poverty line. And this is considered a fairly affluent Native territory. There are some that are simply unlivable. Unlivable. So yes, there are Native people who look at the military as their best option, which is sad beyond belief. Think about a people who feel compelled to enlist in the very military that killed their ancestors. And I don't mean even necessarily just 100 years ago, but certainly 100 years ago and before. I mean, some claim the massacre at Wounded Knee was the final battle, but Native people are being killed by military even today. And the residential schools, which worked hand in hand with the military, because the military was used to help round up our children. The residential schools was another place where Native children died, and where they used our children to commit this act of genocide. And yet there are people today who feel like they've got to join the U.S. military. And ironically, many of these boarding schools were created in some of these military bases. I mean, there's no separate. In fact, one of the few things that Native boys were trained to do was to march. They were being conditioned, even in these boarding schools, to become soldiers. Mindless drones for the U.S. military. Now, I'm not saying anybody who joins the military is mindless, but you don't have choices. I mean, look at all the controversy that got raised when Mark Kelly and others have suggested that as a soldier, you have an obligation to not follow unlawful orders. I mean, they tried to censure him. They tried to go after him for saying that. I mean, it just stands to reason that if you're asked to do something unlawful, regardless of whether you're a soldier, but you know what? Think about the lawful things you're being asked to do, to kill people. You are literally being asked to kill people. First, you got to frame the enemy as enemy combatants, and then you are literally being ordered to kill them. Drop bombs on them, drones, any number of ways. I mean, that's what you signed up for. And think about Native people, knowing all of that history, 250 years of oppression and murder, rape. I mean, I think about the Sand Creek Massacre, the Wounded Knee Massacre, all of these going right from the Revolutionary War, the Moravian Massacre, colonists murdering Native people who weren't even involved in a conflict, just murdering them. Why? Because we were the other, and we're still the other. Because even if you enlist, it doesn't make racism go away. It doesn't include, the only thing it does is it further indoctrinates you. The likelihood that you're going to go into the military and then somehow retain something that the military offered you to bring back to your territory to make your lives better. Some have. Our warrior societies were actually, part of that, the whole birth of, or rebirth of Native warrior societies came out of former military guys who said, no, I got the training. Now I'm going to defend my lands. And now we're considered outlaws because of it. I mean, veterans aren't treated very well in the first place, but certainly people want to prop up Native veterans at powwows. I mean, I'm sorry. If you're marching with an American flag, you're marching with the flag of the enemy. Now, I know that sounds rough, but that's what this show is about, to tell some truth, some hard truth, some uncomfortable truth. So, again, what does it mean to be free versus being a citizen of the United States? And is being a citizen of the United States freedom? I don't think so. I mean, hell, even if you thought you bought property, try not paying your taxes and see what happens. I mean, Native people, we're in a constant struggle to retain, and certainly a bigger struggle yet to reclaim lands. Yeah, we get some token gestures thrown our way, but it's anything but land reclamation. So when Obama declares Bears Ears to be a national monument, it only takes a president like Donald Trump to reduce its size so the lands can be raped again. I just saw a recent thing where the Haudenosaunee were being designated the stewards of certain lands up in the northern Adirondacks by one of the universities up there. Well, what does it mean to be a steward? That's not the same thing as owning the land. And granted, land ownership is a little bit of a different concept when it comes to Native people. We view future generations, not just of our people, but future generations of creation, to be the real owners of the land. Our job is just to take care of it while we're here. And I know that's a bizarre concept for Europeans, and that's part of the reason they were able to create the so-called doctrine of Christian discovery. Oh, you don't own the land. That's literally what they said. That only Christians can assert title. Only Christian nations could assert ownership by title. That's a court said that. I mean, well, the church said it too, but there's no law that says that. But it becomes the foundation for laws to be built upon. That's what's problematic. I know, and I know these are issues that I talk about in great deal, at great length. But I got to tell you, again, getting back to the whole enlistment thing, all I can tell people is please do not encourage, and if to the extent that you can control what your kids do, don't let them enlist in the U.S. military. There are any number of things that people can do, even if they're patriotic, to help their people, to help their country. But to be in a situation where somebody can send you into harm's way or ask you to do something that goes against your own philosophical beliefs, most of the time, most of the U.S. military historically has oppressed indigenous people throughout the globe. That's what they've done. So as a Native person, why would you want to do that? But even as a non-Native person, look, do what you can to pursue the best options and the best prospects for your future. But please, do not enlist in the military. Don't be a part of the U.S. war machine. I guess that's my parting words of wisdom here, from Resistance Radio. Look, I want to thank you for listening. I ask that you support whichever radio station or affiliate that you're listening to this program. Please support Resistance Radio and support the whoever's broadcasting this. And again, if you're listening online, if you're watching this on YouTube or on Facebook, please support WPFW, WBI, and any of the affiliates who are carrying the program. I greatly appreciate it. I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio.